Good day everyone, in this video we're going to talk about quantitative research, particularly the different experimental research designs. But first, let's have a short review of what quantitative research is. Quantitative research is a systematic process of gathering, analyzing, and interpreting quantitative or numeric data for the purpose of obtaining answers to certain questions or phenomena. In other words, quantitative research involves the process of testing a theory, recognizes the role of variables in a study, involves numbers or numeric data, and lastly, uses statistical treatments for data measurement and analysis. Now at this point, we're going to answer the question, what are the types of quantitative research designs? It is worth noting that quantitative research is divided into two major types, namely experimental research designs and descriptive non-experimental. Under experimental research designs, we have the true experimental, quasi-experimental, and pre-experimental. On the other hand, descriptive non-experimental is further divided according to purpose, under which we have survey and correlational research, and according to time dimension. Some examples are cross-sectional research and longitudinal research. Now, while there are a lot of different quantitative research designs, for this particular video, we are going to focus on the different experimental research designs. Now, at this point, we're going to talk about the major characteristics of experimental research designs. First, experimental research recognizes that the intervention of the researcher is present. This means that in experimental research, the researcher plays an active role throughout the conduct of the research process. When we say that the researcher plays an active role, this means that the researcher decides what intervention is given to the subjects. Also, the researcher is the one who determines who will be receiving the treatment and, of course, the extent of the conduct of the research. In connection with the first characteristic, another major characteristic of experimental research is that it involves the researcher's manipulation of independent variables. This means that unlike non-experimental research, the variables in experimental research are controlled by the researchers. When we say that variables are controlled by the researchers, this means that the researcher may opt to control certain variables and manipulate others for purposes of determining alternative results. At this point, we're going to talk about the different types of experimental research designs, starting with the true experimental research. The true experimental research aims to determine causal relationships among variables. Also, it is considered as the most accurate type of experimental research design. Furthermore, the true experimental research design relies on statistical analysis to approve or disprove a hypothesis. It may be conducted with or without a pretest, involves a control group and a test group, and of course, involves random selection of participants. With regard to the different types of true experimental research designs, it may be classified as post-test only control group, pretest post-test control group, or Solomon 4-group design. Now, before we continue, let's address some of the questions that you might have. First, what is the difference between a control group and an experimental or test group? In a true experimental research, the experimental or test group is made of subjects that receive the treatment or intervention given by the researcher. On the other hand, the control group is made of subjects that do not undergo or receive any treatment or intervention. Next, why is there a need to have a control group and an experimental group? Having a control group and an experimental group allows researchers to determine the effects of the treatment or intervention by making comparisons between the results from the experimental group and the control group after the duration of the study. First, let's talk about the post-test only control group. In a post-test only control group, the subjects are randomly selected and assigned to groups. Then, the treatment or intervention is given to the experimental group. Afterwards, both groups are tested and conclusions are drawn from the comparisons of the results. With this in mind, let's consider this example wherein the study is conducted to test the effects of technology integration on the academic performance of students. As mentioned earlier, in an experimental research design, it would involve at least two groups. One group would be the control group, and the other one would be the test or experimental group. The control group would be the one that will have no intervention, which means there is no technology integration, which means everything is held regular or constant throughout the classes. While in the test or experimental group, it would have the intervention, which means there would be the technology integration in the lessons conducted. Furthermore, since this is an example of an experimental research design, it would involve variable manipulation such as the type of technology used and the frequency of the technology used. After a certain duration of time, the results from the control group that has no technology integration and the test group or experimental group that has technology integration in lessons would then be assessed. From there, the grades between the control group and the experimental group will be compared. From this particular example, we could have the conclusion that the integration of technology in conducting lessons has a positive effect on the academic performance of the students. Next, we talk about the pretest posttest control group design. In a pretest posttest control group design, the subjects are also randomly selected and assigned to groups. Both the groups are then tested prior to the intervention and treatment. Afterwards, the intervention or treatment is then given to the experimental group. Both the groups are then tested after the treatment to determine the degree of changes in each group. For this particular type, let's consider this example of a study that is conducted to determine the effect of role-playing as a teaching strategy to the students' reading comprehension. Now, similar to the post-test control group design, we're going to have two groups. One group would be a control group, and the other one would be a test group or an experimental group. However, unlike the post-test control group design wherein both the control group and the test or experimental group is tested after the intervention has been given, in this particular case, both the control group and test or experimental group will undergo a pretest. Afterwards, the same process will be applied wherein the control group will receive no intervention, meaning they will receive the regular teaching strategy or activity, while the test or experimental group will undergo the intervention. In this case, it's going to be the role-playing as a class activity. After which, both groups will have a post-test from which the results will be obtained. From there, the researcher will then address the following questions. First, is there a difference between the pre-test and post-test scores? Next, how are the post-test scores of the test group different from the control group? From there, based on the results gathered, the researcher will then be able to come up with the needed conclusions and recommendations. And lastly, we have the Solomon 4 group design. The Solomon 4 group design is considered as a combination of the first two true experimental designs mentioned earlier. Similar to the two designs mentioned, subjects are also randomly selected. However, for this particular design, the subjects are assigned into 4 groups. It is worth noting that the Solomon 4 group design is conducted to verify the effectiveness of a given treatment or intervention. With this in mind, let's consider this example wherein a study is conducted to determine the effects of an intensive review program on the students' mathematics grades. As mentioned earlier, the subjects are selected randomly. However, there would be 4 groups for this particular design. Now, much like the designs discussed earlier, both experimental group A and experimental group B will receive the treatment. In this case, it is the intensive review program, while control group A and control group B will receive the regular teaching strategy, or they will receive no intervention at all. The only difference is that experimental group A and control group A will have the pretest. From there, both experimental group A and experimental group B will have the intensive review program as part of the intervention, while control group A and control group B will have the regular discussions as part of the regular studies. From there, after the discussion or after the intervention, all groups will undergo a post-test in order to obtain the needed results. Before we continue, let's answer this question. What is the purpose of conducting a Solomon 4 group design? A Solomon 4 group design is conducted for purposes of verifying the authenticity of the results of an intervention. It is worth noting that pretesting tends to have some form of influence on the results of the post-test due to the subject's exposure to the said instrument. This is because the pretest and post-test use the same instrument, technically speaking. The same instrument that you use for the pretest would be the same instrument that you would use for the post-test in order to determine if there would be changes in the results of the scores. As such, there are certain instances wherein some respondents or some subjects tend to simply remember the answers that they have given from the pretest. Conducting a Solomon four-group design allows a researcher to counter this threat to internal validity when making the assessment. In a nutshell, true experimental research is one of the types of experimental research designs. It is recognized by having the following characteristics. First, it is used to test a hypothesis. Second, it involves random selection of participants. Next, it requires having a control group and a test group. Furthermore, it may or may not have a pretest. It is also worth noting that the true experimental research design is considered as the most accurate type of experimental research. Furthermore, true experimental research is divided into three types. First is the post-test only control group. This involves testing the control group and test group after the intervention has been given. Next would be the pretest post-test control group, wherein it tests the control group and the test group before and after the intervention has been given. And the last type is the Solomon four-group design. This is a combination of the first two designs, wherein the respondents are divided into four groups. It is also worth noting that the Solomon four-group design is conducted in order to counter possible threats to internal validity and verify the results of the intervention that has been given.